July 18th, 1965. 18,000 feet above Thanh Hoa Province, North Vietnam. Lieutenant Commander Robert Shumaker felt the F-8 Crusader shudder beneath him as he pulled out of his bombing run. The target, a bridge spanning the Song Ma River, disappeared behind him in a blur of jungle green and muddy brown water. His gloved hand gripped the stick, banking hard right, when the master caution light exploded across his instrument panel. Fire warning, engine. The Pratt & Whitney J-57 turbine screamed, then coughed. Black smoke streamed past his canopy, thick and acrid even through his oxygen mask. He'd been hit. Ground fire, probably a 37mm anti-aircraft gun. The North Vietnamese gunners were getting better, tracking faster, anticipating the American attack patterns. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Checkmate 203 is hit and losing power. His voice remained steady despite the stick going sluggish in his hands. The altimeter unwound. 16,000 feet, 14,000, 12,000, too fast. The hydraulics were gone. He tried the radio again. Nothing but static. At 8,000 feet, Robert Shumaker made the decision that would define the next 8 years of his life. He reached between his legs and pulled the ejection handle. The canopy explosive bolts detonated with a crack that he felt in his chest. The rocket motor beneath his seat ignited, and the world became a violent, spinning chaos of sky and ground and smoke. The drogue chute deployed with a snap that nearly broke his neck. Then the main canopy blossomed above him, a beautiful white flower of nylon that suddenly made everything silent except for the wind. He was floating now, suspended in the humid air above North Vietnam. Below him, his F-8 carved a black streak across the sky before auguring into a rice paddy with a distant crump. Smoke billowed upward in a funeral pyre of American aviation technology and his old life. The ground rushed up faster than he expected. He could see them now, figures in dark clothing and conical hats running through the paddies toward his projected landing point. Dozens of them. Maybe more. He reached for his survival radio, keyed it once, twice. Still nothing. The radio was dead or jammed. His boots hit the muddy water of a rice paddy with a splash. He went down to his knees in the muck, fumbling with his parachute release, but his hands were shaking now. Not from fear, not yet, but from adrenaline. The chute dragged him sideways through the water until he managed to hit the releases. The harness fell away. He had his .38 revolver, 6 rounds. Against what he could now see was at least 50 Vietnamese militia members converging on his position. They were shouting, pointing, some carrying rifles, others farming implements. A few were children no older than 12 or 13. Robert Shumaker, a 27-year-old graduate of the Naval Academy, veteran of countless carrier operations, trained in survival and evasion, made another calculation. He slowly raised his hands above his head, the revolver dangling from one finger by the trigger guard. The first militiaman to reach him was an old man with maybe 3 teeth left in his mouth. He grabbed the revolver, then struck Robert across the face with the butt of a rifle. The taste of blood filled his mouth. Another blow to the ribs drove the air from his lungs. They were on him then, a dozen hands pulling, hitting, tearing at his flight suit, his survival vest, his boots. Someone yanked his arms behind his back and bound them with rough rope. The bindings bit into his wrists, tight enough that his fingers immediately began to tingle. They hauled him to his feet and shoved him forward, trudging through the rice paddy toward a dirt road where a military truck was already approaching. Robert tried to remember his training, name, rank, service number, and date of birth. That's all the Geneva Convention required him to give. The North Vietnamese were signatories to that convention. They would have to treat him according to international law. Humane treatment, medical care, communication with the International Red Cross. He was still clinging to these thoughts 3 hours later when the truck pulled through the gates of a prison in Hanoi. The French had built it in 1896 to hold Vietnamese revolutionaries. The Vietnamese called it Hỏa Lò, the fiery furnace. The Americans would come to know it by another name. Welcome to the Hanoi Hilton. The truck lurched to a stop in a courtyard surrounded by high walls topped with broken glass embedded in concrete. Robert Shumaker, still bound and bleeding from the beating in the rice paddy, was dragged from the truck bed onto cobblestones worn smooth by decades of prisoners' feet. The air here was different from the countryside, thick with the smell of human waste, rot, and something else he couldn't identify. Fear, maybe, or despair. 2 guards in khaki uniforms grabbed him under the arms and hauled him toward a low building with peeling yellow paint. Above the doorway, iron letters spelled out words in French that he couldn't read. Through another door, down a corridor so narrow his shoulders nearly touched both walls, then into a room barely 10 feet square. They threw him onto a wooden stool in the center of the room. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. Behind a desk sat a man in a crisp uniform, his face round and soft, almost cherubic. He might have been 40 or 60. Impossible to tell. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the light, hiding his eyes. "I am Rabbit," the man said in heavily accented English. It wasn't his real name. Robert would never learn that, but it's what the prisoners would call him for years to come. "You are criminal. You bomb innocent civilian. You murder women and children." Lieutenant Commander Robert Shumaker, United States Navy. Service number 626147. Date of birth, May 11th, 1933. His voice sounded stronger than he felt. Rabbit smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Geneva Convention, yes? You think Geneva Convention protect you here?" He stood, walked around the desk, and stopped inches from Robert's face. "You not prisoner of war. You are air pirate, war criminal. We do not have to follow convention for criminal." The words hit Robert harder than the rifle butt had. This wasn't in the training. The instructors at survival school had covered interrogation techniques, sleep deprivation, stress positions, verbal abuse, but they'd always prefaced it with the assumption that the Geneva Convention would provide a baseline of protection, a floor beneath which treatment couldn't fall. That floor had just disappeared. "I need your help to complete this form," Rabbit continued, returning to his desk and sliding a sheet of paper across the surface. "You write your name, your unit, your ship, your mission, your target. You write what aircraft you fly, what weapons you carry, simple information. Then you go to cell, you rest, you eat. Very simple." Robert stared at the paper. Name, rank, service number, date of birth. That was all. That was the line. "I cannot provide that information." Rabbit sighed like a disappointed teacher. He said something in Vietnamese to the guards. They moved before Robert could react, yanking him off the stool and forcing him face down onto the concrete floor. One guard knelt on his back while the other pulled his already bound arms upward behind him. The pain was immediate and extraordinary. His shoulders screamed in protest as the guard pulled higher, higher, until Robert felt something pop in his right shoulder socket. A sound came from his throat, not quite a scream, not yet, but a guttural moan of pure agony. "Stop!" Rabbit's voice cut through the red haze of pain. The guard released the pressure. Robert gasped, his cheek pressed against the dirty concrete, his entire body shaking. "You see? This is nothing. Nothing at all. I ask you again, fill out the form." They hauled him back onto the stool. His right arm hung useless, the shoulder dislocated or badly damaged. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the evening coolness. Through the pain, Robert tried to think. They wanted information, squadron data, ship names, target lists, information that could get other pilots killed. "Name, rank, service number, date of birth," he whispered. What happened next would become routine, almost monotonous, over the coming months and years. But that first night in the Hanoi Hilton, it was revelation, a glimpse into how far human cruelty could extend when justified by ideology and wrapped in the flag of revolution. They took him to another room, smaller, no furniture except for iron stakes driven into the concrete floor. The guards forced him onto his knees, pulled his arms behind his back, and began wrapping rope around his biceps. Not regular rope. This was rough hemp, maybe half an inch thick, the kind used on fishing boats. They wrapped it tight, loop after loop, from his elbows to his shoulders, then yanked both ends. Robert's arms were forced together behind his back, his elbows touching, his shoulders rotating backward in their sockets in a position the human body was never designed to achieve. The pain transcended anything he'd known existed. It was electrical, white-hot, consuming every nerve ending from his fingertips to his neck. He screamed then. Couldn't help it. Screamed until his voice gave out, until he was making sounds that weren't quite human anymore. Rabbit's face appeared in front of him, still wearing that soft smile. Ready to fill out form now? Through tears and snot and saliva, Robert Shumaker whispered, "Go to hell." They left him like that for 4 hours. When they finally cut the ropes, he collapsed onto the floor. His arms were purple and swollen, his hands completely numb. He couldn't feel his fingers. For a terrifying moment, he thought they might have to amputate. But sensation slowly returned, pins and needles, then burning, then the deep ache of damaged tissue. 2 guards dragged him through more corridors, past cells with barred windows where he caught glimpses of other men in ragged clothes, hollow-eyed and silent. They threw him into a cell barely 6 feet by 6 feet. The door, solid wood with a small hatch at the bottom, slammed shut. A lock turned. Footsteps receded. Robert lay on the concrete floor in the darkness, his body broken, his mind reeling. The Geneva Convention wasn't going to save him. His training wasn't adequate. The survival school instructors had prepared him for a war that followed rules. This was something else entirely. Outside his cell, in the suffocating darkness of Hỏa Lò Prison, Robert Shumaker began to understand that he had entered not just a prison, but a laboratory. A place where the North Vietnamese were experimenting with the systematic destruction of the human will. And he was about to become their test subject for the next 8 years. The darkness in the cell was absolute. Not the darkness of a room at night where your eyes eventually adjust and you can make out shapes and shadows. This was the darkness of a tomb, complete and suffocating. Robert couldn't see his hand when he held it inches from his face. He couldn't see the walls, the door, the ceiling. For all his senses could tell him, he was floating in a void. Time became meaningless. He might have been there for hours or days. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and his arms felt like they belonged to someone else, distant, swollen things that responded sluggishly when he tried to move them. The concrete floor leached the heat from his body. He was shivering now, his flight suit still damp with sweat and rice paddy water. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by pain and the sounds of the prison. Screams echoed through the walls, high-pitched, desperate sounds that didn't seem like they could come from human throats. Footsteps in the corridor, metal doors clanging, voices shouting in Vietnamese, and underneath it all, a persistent dripping sound somewhere in the darkness that began to feel like a metronome counting out the seconds of his captivity. The food slot at the bottom of the door scraped open, letting in a sliver of light that seemed bright as the sun after the complete darkness. A tin cup slid through, followed by a small bowl. The slot slammed shut. Darkness returned. Robert crawled to the door, his damaged shoulders protesting every movement. The cup contained water, or something approximating water. It was brown and smelled of rust and things he didn't want to think about. The bowl held a handful of rice with something dark mixed in. Not meat. Maybe seaweed. Maybe something that had once been a vegetable. He drank the water and ate the rice. All of it. He was hungry enough that his stomach didn't care about taste or safety. 3 days later, or what he thought was 3 days, marked by 9 meals delivered through the slot, they came for him again. The interrogation room was the same. Rabbit sat behind the same desk wearing the same expression of mild disappointment, like a father dealing with a stubborn child. But this time, there were 2 other men in the room. One was tall for a Vietnamese with a severe face and colonel's insignia on his collar. The prisoners would later call him Cat, short for the Cat, though no one could remember who gave him the name first. The other man was younger, thick-necked, with small eyes set close together and a permanent sneer. He would become known as Pig Eye, and he would prove to be one of the most sadistic guards in the entire prison system. "Lieutenant Commander Shumaker," Rabbit began, his English slightly better than their first meeting, as if he'd been practicing, "you have had time to think about your situation, time to understand that we are serious. I hope you are now ready to cooperate." Robert's voice was hoarse from disuse and screaming. "Name, rank, service number, date of birth." Cat spoke sharply in Vietnamese. Pig Eye grinned. They didn't bother with the preliminary beating this time. Pig Eye grabbed Robert by the collar and dragged him to another room, one Robert hadn't seen before. This one had equipment: a wooden saw bench, iron bars, ropes of different thicknesses coiled in the corner like sleeping serpents, and on a small table, a collection of items that made Robert's stomach turn: pliers, bamboo slivers, rubber hoses filled with sand. The rope torture started the same as before, bindings around the biceps pulled tight, forcing his elbows together. But this time, Pig Eye added a refinement. After securing Robert's arms, he looped another rope around his neck and tied it to his ankles, which had been bound together behind him. The position forced Robert into a backward arch, his spine bent at an unnatural angle, his neck muscles straining to keep his windpipe open. If he relaxed, the rope tightened around his throat. If he tried to ease the pressure on his spine, he started to choke. It was a masterpiece of cruel engineering, a torture that made the victim complicit in his own suffering. "Your squadron designation," Rabbit said calmly, consulting a notepad. "Your commanding officer's name, the name of your aircraft carrier. These are simple facts, not military secrets. We already know much of this from other sources. We simply need you to confirm." The lie was obvious, even through the fog of pain. If they already knew, they wouldn't need confirmation. Every piece of information Robert gave them could be used to construct a larger intelligence picture. Ship movements, squadron strengths, operational patterns, information that would kill other pilots. "Go! To hell!" Pig Eye kicked him in the ribs. The pain was sharp and immediate, but almost welcome compared to the slow, grinding agony of the ropes. Robert's vision grayed at the edges. His lungs burned for air. The rope around his throat tightened as his muscles weakened. He was going to die here, in this room, on this floor. The thought came with strange clarity and almost with relief. At least it would end. But they didn't let him die. Pig Eye cut the throat rope at the last moment, and Robert gasped air in huge, ragged breaths. His body was shaking uncontrollably now, going into shock. They left the arm ropes in place. Rabbit knelt beside him, his face close enough that Robert could smell his breath, cigarettes and tea. "You think you are strong. You think you are hero. But everyone breaks, Lieutenant Commander, everyone. Some take days, some take weeks. But in the end, they all break. The only question is how much damage you suffer first." They kept him in the ropes for 6 hours that day. When they finally cut them loose, Robert couldn't move his arms at all. The guards had to carry him back to his cell like a piece of luggage. They dropped him on the concrete and left. In the darkness, Robert wept. Not from the pain, though that was extraordinary. Not from fear, though he was terrified. He wept from the terrible understanding that Rabbit was right. There was a breaking point built into every human being, a threshold of suffering beyond which the body and mind simply stopped functioning. And the North Vietnamese had refined the process of finding that threshold with scientific precision. The survival school instructors had taught resistance techniques, focus on something else, count in your head, remember loved ones, maintain military bearing, but those techniques assumed a finite period of suffering. An interrogation session that would eventually end. A guard shift that would change. A rescue that might come. Here in the Hanoi Hilton, there was no end in sight, no shift change that brought relief. No rescue force coming. Just day after day of calculated cruelty, applied with the patience of men who had all the time in the world and knew exactly how to use it. Over the following weeks, Robert learned the full vocabulary of North Vietnamese torture techniques. The rope torture came in variations, some that lasted hours, some that lasted minutes but were more intense. There were the leg irons, iron bars that locked around both ankles, spreader bars that forced the legs apart until the hip joints screamed in protest. There were stress positions, kneeling on concrete for hours with arms extended, standing on tiptoes with arms raised overhead until the muscles gave out and you collapsed. And always, there was the interrogation. The same questions asked different ways, the same demands for information, propaganda statements, confessions of war crimes. Rabbit and Cat and Pig Eye and a rotating cast of other interrogators whose names or nicknames Robert would learn. Spot, Dum Dum, Eagle, Soft Soap Fairy. Some were more brutal than others. Some used fists and boots. Others preferred the refined cruelty of the ropes. But they all shared the same patient, methodical approach. They weren't interested in quick answers extracted through momentary pain. They wanted systematic, complete destruction of resistance. And they were very, very good at their job. 3 months into his captivity, or what Robert calculated as 3 months based on meal counts and the faint changes in temperature that suggested the passage of seasons, they moved him to a different cell block. The guards called it Little Las Vegas. The American prisoners would come to call it Heartbreak Hotel. The cell was smaller than the first, maybe 5 feet by 7 feet. A concrete slab protruded from one wall, the bed, a bucket in the corner, the toilet, that was all. No window, no ventilation except for a small gap under the door. The walls were covered in grime and stains that Robert tried not to think about. Some of the stains looked like blood. Some looked like other things. The door slammed shut. The lock turned. And Robert was alone. Truly, completely alone in a way he had never experienced in his life. In the first cell, at least there had been the sounds of other prisoners, the screams, the coughs, the scraping of bodies against concrete. Here, the walls were thicker. The silence was profound, broken only by his own breathing and the hammering of his heart. The isolation wasn't an accident or a byproduct of crowding. It was deliberate, calculated. The North Vietnamese understood something that Western militaries were only beginning to grasp, that isolation could break a man more completely than any physical torture. Hours bled into days, days into weeks. Robert tried to maintain a routine. He exercised, push-ups, sit-ups, squats, until his damaged shoulders couldn't take any more. Then he'd do leg exercises. He counted. He recited everything he could remember. Poems from high school, procedures from flight manuals, the names of every classmate from the Naval Academy. But the mind, deprived of external stimulation, begins to turn inward, begins to consume itself. Robert started having conversations with people who weren't there. His wife, Jane, would appear in the corner of the cell, and he'd talk to her for hours about their wedding, about the house they'd planned to buy, about the children they'd hoped to have. His academy roommate, Dave, would sit on the concrete slab and they'd discuss football games they'd watched years ago. He knew they weren't real. Some part of his mind maintained that awareness, but the hallucinations were so vivid, so desperately needed, that he welcomed them anyway. The interrogations continued, but they changed character. Now Rabbit would bring him to the interrogation room and simply talk. Not about military intelligence, but about politics, about the war, about America's crimes against the Vietnamese people. Hours of political lectures delivered in that same patient, disappointed tone. "Your government lies to you," Rabbit would say, showing Robert newspapers, copies of the New York Times, the Washington Post, with headlines about anti-war protests, race riots, political assassinations. "Your country is destroying itself. Your people want peace. But you continue to fight. Why?" Robert tried not to listen, but in the isolation of his cell the words echoed. Was the war going badly? Were there really massive protests at home? How long had he been here? 6 months? A year? Did anyone even remember he was missing? They brought him a tape recorder one day. "We want you to make a statement," Cat explained, his severe face expressionless. "Just a simple message to your wife. Tell her you are alive, you are well treated, you hope for peace. Very simple." The temptation was overwhelming, to send a message home, to let Jane know he was alive. But Robert knew the game. Any recording would be edited, manipulated, used for propaganda. His voice would be broadcast saying things he never said, supporting positions he didn't hold. No. The beating that followed was perfunctory, almost routine. They'd done this dance before. Pig Eye administered it with the bored efficiency of a factory worker on an assembly line. 20 blows with a rubber hose, back to the cell. But that night, lying on the concrete slab, Robert heard something. A sound so faint he thought at first it was another hallucination. A tapping. Rhythmic, deliberate. Coming from the wall, tap, tap, pause, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. He sat up, pressed his ear against the grimy concrete. The tapping continued. There was a pattern to it. A structure. Not random noise from construction or rats in the walls. This was intentional. This was communication. Robert's heart hammered in his chest. There was someone else. Someone on the other side of this wall. Another American. He wasn't alone, but he didn't know the code. The tapping meant nothing to him. Just random patterns that could have been anything. He tapped back anyway. 3 slow knocks. A pause. 3 more knocks. The response was immediate. A rapid series of taps. Tap, 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 tap. Pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. Robert pressed his forehead against the wall, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't understand the message, but the message underneath was clear. I'm here. You're not alone. Hold on. Over the following days, the tapping continued. Different patterns, different rhythms. Robert tried to decode it. He thought about Morse code. That was the obvious choice. But the patterns didn't match. Too many short sequences, not enough variation. Then, a week later, they threw a new prisoner into the cell next door. Robert could hear the scuffle, the door slamming, the guard's boots receding. And then, that night, new tapping. This prisoner was persistent, methodical. He would tap a sequence, wait, then tap it again. Over and over, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 1 through 5. That was it. That was the key. A 5x5 matrix, a grid. Each position in the grid represented a letter of the alphabet. The first series of taps indicated the row. The second series indicated the column. Robert worked it out in his head. First row, A, B, C, D, E. Second row, F, G, H, I, J. The letter K was omitted. C could substitute. Third row, L, M, N, O, P. Fourth row, Q, R, S, T, U. Fifth row, V, W, X, Y, Z. To spell hello, you'd tap 23 H, 15 E, 31 L, 31 L, 34 O. That night, Robert tapped his first message through the wall. Who are you? The response came back. Rutledge, Air Force. You? Shumaker, Navy. 3 words, 12 letters. But they meant everything. They meant he was part of something larger than his own suffering, part of a community, a resistance, a brotherhood of prisoners who refused to be isolated despite the walls between them. Over the following weeks, the tap code spread through Heartbreak Hotel like a virus. Each prisoner who learned it taught it to his neighbors. Questions and answers flowed through the concrete. Names, ranks, shoot-down dates, news about interrogations, tortures, which guards to fear most. And then came the organizational messages. Senior officers establishing a chain of command through the walls. Orders passed from cell to cell. Resist. Give only name, rank, service number, date of birth. Take torture if necessary. Do not make propaganda statements. Do not provide military intelligence. The North Vietnamese knew something was happening. They couldn't isolate the Americans anymore. Not truly. But they couldn't figure out the communication method. They would burst into cells at random times, searching for contraband radios, hidden notes, anything that could explain how the prisoners were coordinating their resistance. They never thought to listen to the walls. Robert learned that he wasn't the first American prisoner. There were others who'd been there longer, some since 1964. He learned the names of the different cell blocks, the nicknames for the guards, the layout of the prison. Information passed through walls in the darkness, building a mental map of their confinement. But with community came new forms of suffering. Because now, when the guards dragged a prisoner to interrogation, the others could hear through the walls, could hear the screams, the pleading, the eventual breaking, could count the hours someone was gone and wonder if they'd come back. And sometimes they didn't come back. Tap code messages would flow. Anyone hear from Parker? Silence from Parker's cell. Days of silence. Then, finally, tapping from a new prisoner moved into that cell. Found a name scratched in wall. Parker. Date 2 months ago. Nothing else. Robert learned to sleep with one hand pressed against the wall, feeling for the vibrations of incoming messages. Learned to tap so softly that only the person in the next cell could hear, the sound masked by his movements. Learned the abbreviations and shorthand that made communication faster. GBU for God bless you, GN for good night, QFD for quick fuse diffusing when guards were approaching. The isolation cell was meant to break them, but through the walls, through the patient tapping of desperate men refusing to be silent, they transformed it into something else, a network, a command structure, a resistance movement conducted in whispers of concrete and determination. But the North Vietnamese were learning too, and what came next would test whether tap code and community could withstand systematic, escalating brutality designed to shatter not just individuals, but the entire structure of resistance they'd built. August 1966. Robert had been a prisoner for over a year now. The tap code network had expanded throughout Hỏa Lò Prison and into the outlying camps where some prisoners had been moved. Through the walls came news that more pilots were being shot down every week. The prison population was growing, and with it the resistance was becoming more organized, more sophisticated. The senior ranking officer, or SRO, was Navy Commander James Stockdale, shot down in September 1965. His orders came through the walls with military precision. Return with honor became the code of conduct. Resist to the point of permanent physical or mental injury, but no further. Give them nothing that could be used for propaganda or intelligence purposes. And above all, maintain military discipline and unity. But maintaining that unity required something the tap code alone couldn't provide. It required face-to-face communication, planning, coordination that went beyond simple messages tapped through concrete. The opportunity came during mandatory exercise periods. Once every few days, the guards would take prisoners out of their cells for 15 minutes in a small courtyard. The rule was absolute silence and no communication. Violators would be beaten and returned to their cells. But the Americans developed a new language, a silent language. They called it the cup code. One prisoner would hold his drinking cup in different positions, against his chest, against his thigh, at shoulder height, down by his hip. Each position corresponded to a number 1 through 5, same as the tap code. By watching the cup movements, prisoners could spell out messages to each other even with guards watching. But there was an even more brazen method. When prisoners were taken to interrogation or torture sessions, they were walked through corridors past other cells. In those brief moments of passage, a prisoner might clear his throat in a pattern, cough, 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 spelling out letters in the tap code rhythm. Or they would scrape their feet on the floor, or tap their fingers against the wall as they passed. The guards heard the sounds but couldn't understand the significance. They were living inside a web of communication that was invisible to them. One prisoner, Air Force Captain Carlisle "Smitty" Harris, even developed a way to communicate during interrogation. When Rabbit would show him propaganda materials or demand responses, Smitty would blink in tap code, short blinks and long blinks, spelling out messages to other Americans who might be watching through cracks in doors or holes in walls. The Vietnamese thought he had something in his eye, but the system that worked so well also created new vulnerabilities. Because if one man broke under torture, truly broke, not just gave up tactical information but revealed the communication methods, the entire network would collapse. Lieutenant Commander Robert Shumaker was about to discover exactly how far the North Vietnamese would go to break that network. It started with a routine interrogation. Rabbit, Cat, and a new officer, one the prisoners called Spot because of the prominent birthmark on his face, sat behind the desk. But this time, they didn't ask about military information. They asked about the tap code. "We know you communicate with other criminals," Spot said in surprisingly good English. He must have studied in the Soviet Union or China. "We know you have system. You will tell us how this system works." Robert's blood went cold. How did they know? Had someone talked? Or had they simply figured out that communication was happening and were fishing for confirmation? "I don't know what you're talking about." Spot smiled. It was worse than Rabbit's disappointed father routine or Cat's severe coldness. Spot smiled like a man who genuinely enjoyed what came next. They took him to a room he hadn't seen before, larger than the usual interrogation spaces. In the center stood what looked like a metal bed frame, tilted at a slight angle. Heavy iron manacles were bolted to each corner. Along one wall, a table held various instruments. Robert recognized some from previous sessions, but others were new. Medical instruments, surgical tools. "Last chance," Spot said. "Explain the communication system. Name, rank, service number." Pig Eye hit him in the mouth, splitting his lip. Blood filled his mouth, copper-tasting and warm. Two guards grabbed him and forced him onto the metal frame, locking his wrists and ankles into the manacles. The metal was cold against his skin through the thin cotton of his prison uniform. They tilted the frame backward until Robert was nearly horizontal, his head lower than his feet. Then Pig Eye appeared above him holding a bucket and a filthy rag. Robert had heard about waterboarding from the survival school instructors, but only in abstract terms. The reality was worse than anything he could have imagined. The rag went over his face, covering his nose and mouth. Then water, cold, dirty water, poured over the rag in a steady stream. The drowning sensation was immediate and overwhelming. His body's entire panic response activated at once. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't think beyond the desperate primal need for air. His lungs burned, his throat convulsed. Every muscle in his body strained against the manacles, trying to get away from the water, but there was nowhere to go. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. It felt like hours. They pulled the rag away. Robert gasped and choked and vomited water onto his own face. Through streaming eyes, he saw Spot standing over him, that smile still in place. "The communication system," Spot said calmly. "Explain it." Robert tried to speak, but could only cough up more water. His throat was raw, his lungs still burning. He shook his head. The rag went back over his face. More water, more drowning, more dying, without actually being allowed to die. They did it 17 times that day. Robert counted the first few, then lost track. Between each session, Spot would ask about the communication methods. Between each refusal, the water came again. By the end, Robert was broken in a way the rope torture had never achieved. His mind was fractured, his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. He was babbling, crying, begging them to stop. He would have told them anything, given them anything if he could just make it stop. But here's the thing about breaking. There are different kinds. There's the breaking where you give up information, where you betray your brothers, where you trade their lives for your own comfort. And then there's the breaking where your mind simply shuts down, where the self retreats so far inward that there's nobody left to interrogate. Robert went to that second place. When they asked about the communication system, he stared at them with empty eyes and didn't respond because he genuinely couldn't understand the question anymore. The words didn't mean anything. Nothing meant anything except the need to make the water stop. They threw him back in his cell that night, more dead than alive. He lay on the concrete, shivering and vomiting, his mind a shattered mess of fragments that wouldn't cohere into thoughts. And then, through the wall, came the tapping, gentle, patient, persistent. "Shoo, you there? Shoo, respond." The sound pulled him back, pulled him out of the fractured place and into something resembling consciousness. His hand moved to the wall almost by instinct, a weak tap. "Here." "What happened?" Robert couldn't explain, couldn't organize his thoughts enough to spell out the horror of the waterboarding. So he tapped something simpler. "Bad day." The response came immediately. "You did good. We're proud. Rest now." 4 simple sentences, 21 words. But they rebuilt something in Robert that the torture had tried to destroy. They reminded him that he wasn't alone, that his suffering mattered, that there were men on the other side of these walls who understood, who had been through similar horrors, who would tap through concrete to tell him he'd done enough. Over the following days, as Robert slowly recovered, messages flowed through the tap code network about the new interrogation technique. Warnings were passed cell to cell, strategies were discussed. Senior officers sent orders, "Resist as long as possible. Breaking is not failure. Survival is success." The North Vietnamese continued to search for the communication method. They increased cell searches, moved prisoners to different blocks without warning, tried to disrupt the network. But the tap code was too simple, too elegant, too deeply embedded in the culture of American POWs by this point. What the Vietnamese didn't understand was that they weren't fighting against a code or a system. They were fighting against something more fundamental, the human need for connection, for community, for meaning beyond mere survival. You could torture a man until he broke. You could isolate him until he hallucinated, but you couldn't stop him from tapping on a wall. And you couldn't stop another man from tapping back. In December 1966, a new prisoner arrived in the cell next to Robert's. Air Force Major Fred Cherry, one of the first African-American pilots shot down over North Vietnam. He'd been badly injured during ejection, broken shoulder, shattered ankle, infected wounds. The Vietnamese had barely treated him, apparently deciding that a black American prisoner had little propaganda value. Robert could hear Fred's labored breathing through the wall, could hear him groaning in pain. That night, Robert tapped a message. "Who are you?" The response was weak, the tapping irregular. "Cherry, Air Force, hurt bad." "Hang on. We're here. You're not alone." Over the following weeks, Robert and the other prisoners conducted a medical treatment through the walls. They couldn't provide medicine or surgery, but they could provide something almost as valuable: knowledge and hope. Instructions for exercises that would prevent muscle atrophy, advice on cleaning wounds, encouragement when the pain became unbearable. Fred Cherry survived. Years later, he would credit the TAP code and the community it created as the only reason he made it through those first months. The TAP code saved lives. It maintained sanity. It built an invisible army inside the walls of Hỏa Lò Prison, an army that couldn't be seen or touched, but that was more powerful than any physical force because it was built on something the North Vietnamese could never understand. It was built on the simple, stubborn refusal to be alone. Spring 1967. The prison population at Hỏa Lò had swollen beyond capacity. The air campaign over North Vietnam was intensifying, and more pilots were being shot down every week. The Vietnamese response was to establish satellite camps around Hanoi, places the Americans would come to know by names like the Zoo, the Plantation, Alcatraz, and Skid Row. Robert Shumaker was moved to a camp called Alcatraz, reserved for what the Vietnamese considered the most resistant prisoners. 11 men total, isolated in a small compound with cells barely large enough to lie down in. The walls were thick concrete. The windows, small openings near the ceiling, were bricked up. Even the TAP code was difficult here, the walls so thick that messages had to be pounded hard enough to be heard through 3 feet of concrete and brick. But the Americans adapted. They always adapted. When they couldn't tap through walls, they tapped on pipes. The prison's plumbing system ran through all the cells, and metal conducted sound better than concrete. A tap on a water pipe in one cell could be heard in every cell connected to that system. The Vietnamese couldn't understand why the Americans were so interested in the pipes, why they spent so much time near the walls where the plumbing entered their cells. The orders from the senior officers were clear: resist. Every day, resist in every way possible, not just during interrogations, but in every aspect of prison life. Resist through non-cooperation. Resist through maintaining military bearing. Resist through small acts of defiance that the guards might not even notice, but that the prisoners would recognize in each other. Air Force Captain Ron Stortz developed an elaborate resistance technique during required propaganda film viewings. The Vietnamese would gather prisoners to watch films about the war, footage of dead American pilots, destroyed aircraft, civilian casualties from bombing raids. The goal was demoralization and guilt. Ron would sit in the viewing room with his eyes open, staring at the screen, but he wasn't watching. He'd trained himself to focus his eyes on the space between himself and the screen, defocusing until the images became meaningless blurs. To the guards, he appeared to be watching. In reality, he was somewhere else entirely, mentally flying missions, planning escapes, composing letters to his wife that he'd never be able to send. Other prisoners developed their own techniques. Some would silently recite poetry or scripture during interrogations, letting the torturer's words wash over them while their minds held on to something else. Others would do complex mathematical calculations, designing aircraft, calculating fuel consumption, working through engineering problems that had nothing to do with the war but that kept their minds sharp and focused on something other than pain. Navy Lieutenant Commander Jim Stockdale, the senior ranking officer, pushed resistance to levels that defied comprehension. When the Vietnamese demanded he appear in a propaganda film, he knew he couldn't refuse indefinitely. The torture would continue until he either died or complied, so he took a third option. The night before the scheduled filming, Stockdale beat his own face with a wooden stool until it was a swollen, bloody mess. His eyes were nearly shut, his lips split, his nose broken. He was unfilmable. The propaganda value disappeared. When the guards discovered what he'd done, they were furious. Cat himself came to Stockdale's cell. "You are insane," he said, the first time Robert had ever heard the usually controlled officer lose his composure. "Maybe," Stockdale replied through his ruined mouth. "But you can't use me now." Word of Stockdale's action spread through the TAP code network. It was horrifying and inspiring in equal measure. It showed the Vietnamese that the Americans would go to any length, including self-mutilation, rather than cooperate with propaganda efforts. And it showed the other prisoners what true resistance looked like. But resistance came with a price. The torture intensified in direct proportion to the refusal to cooperate. Robert experienced the full range of Vietnamese punishment techniques during his time at Alcatraz. The rope torture had evolved into more sophisticated forms. Now they would bind his arms and legs together behind his back in a position called hell cuffs, a metal cuff around each wrist and each ankle, all four connected by a chain, shortened until his body was bent backward like a bow. Hours in this position caused nerve damage that some prisoners never fully recovered from. There were the leg irons, heavy iron bars locked around both ankles, sometimes with the legs spread wide, sometimes with the ankles chained together so you couldn't walk. Prisoners would live in leg irons for months at a time, the metal rubbing their ankles raw, the wounds becoming infected in the tropical heat and humidity. There was fan belt treatment, beatings with rubber fan belts from old vehicles. The rubber didn't break the skin as easily as other implements, so there were fewer visible scars, but the deep tissue damage was extensive, muscles bruised down to the bone, kidneys damaged, internal bleeding that had nowhere to drain. And always, there was the isolation and sensory deprivation, days or weeks in darkness with minimal food and water. The human mind begins to deteriorate without stimulation. Hallucinations become more frequent. Time sense disappears entirely. Some prisoners couldn't remember how long they'd been in isolation. Days and weeks blurred together into an eternal present tense of suffering. But here's what the Vietnamese never quite understood. The torture was designed to break individuals, to isolate each man in his own personal hell, and make him feel that cooperation was the only path to survival. What they failed to account for was that the TAP code and the resistance culture it created had transformed these isolated individuals into a unified force. When Robert was tortured, he knew that men in cells around him were listening, were counting the hours, were ready to send encouragement through the walls when he returned. That knowledge, that he wasn't suffering alone, that his resistance mattered to someone beyond himself, gave him strength that pure individual willpower could never provide. The prisoners developed a ritual for after-torture sessions. When a man was returned to his cell broken and bleeding, the TAP code messages would flow, "Welcome back. You did good. Rest now. We're with you." Those messages meant everything. They meant the suffering hadn't been meaningless. They meant someone was bearing witness. They meant you were part of something larger than your own pain. In late 1967, the Vietnamese launched what they called Make Your Choice program. Each prisoner was given a simple ultimatum: cooperate with camp regulations, stop communicating with other prisoners, and accept early release, or continue resisting and face indefinite torture and isolation. The choice seemed obvious. Cooperation meant survival, maybe even going home. Resistance meant more suffering with no end in sight. But the senior officers sent clear orders through the TAP code. No early release. Americans would go home in order of capture. To accept early release would be to abandon your brothers, to let the Vietnamese split the unity that had been built at such cost. Robert Shumaker's turn came in December. Cat and Rabbit brought him to an interrogation room and laid out the offer. "You have suffered enough," Rabbit said, his voice almost gentle. "You have been here 2.5 years. Your wife waits for you. Your family needs you. Just sign this statement acknowledging humane treatment and you can go home." The paper sat on the desk between them. A simple document, no more than a page. Just a few paragraphs about how well he'd been treated, how the Vietnamese people bore no ill will toward Americans, how peace was possible if only the U.S. would stop its aggression. Robert stared at the paper. He thought about Jane, about home, about sleeping in a real bed, eating real food, living without constant pain. The temptation was overwhelming. Then he thought about the men in the cells around him, about Stockdale with his ruined face, about Fred Cherry barely surviving his injuries, about all the prisoners who had tapped through walls to keep each other sane, about the years of suffering that would be betrayed by signing this paper. "No," he said quietly. The beating that followed was savage. Pig-Eye administered it with particular enthusiasm, as if Robert's refusal was a personal insult. Rubber hoses, fists, boots. Robert curled into a ball on the floor and took it, his mind retreating to that distant place where pain was just information, just signals from a body that seemed to belong to someone else. When they finally stopped, Rabbit stood over him. "You are a fool. You choose suffering over freedom. This makes no sense." Robert spat blood onto the concrete. "You wouldn't understand." And they didn't. The Vietnamese operated from a fundamentally different cultural framework. To them, individual survival was paramount, face-saving was important, adapting to circumstances was wisdom, not weakness. The idea that Americans would choose collective loyalty over individual survival, that they would suffer torture rather than abandon brothers they might never even see, was incomprehensible. But that's exactly what the prisoners did, man after man. When offered early release, refused. Some broke under torture and signed statements they later found ways to repudiate. Some accepted releases they later felt guilty about for decades. But the overwhelming majority held the line. The resistance became legendary even among the Vietnamese guards. Some of the younger guards, those who hadn't been completely hardened by ideology or war, began to show grudging respect. They would look at these stubborn Americans who refused to break, who tapped through walls, who maintained military bearing even when reduced to walking skeletons, and they saw something they hadn't expected to see. They saw soldiers, real soldiers, the kind who would rather die than quit. And in the darkness of Hỏa Lò Prison, in cells where men suffered beyond description, that recognition mattered. Because resistance wasn't just about refusing to cooperate, it was about maintaining identity, about being soldiers, not victims, about proving to themselves and to each other that they were more than what the torture tried to reduce them to. The tap code made that possible. In the silence between interrogations, in the long nights of isolation, the tapping continued. Messages of encouragement, jokes, news, orders, prayers. An entire world built from nothing but the determination to remain human, to remain connected, to remain undefeated even in defeat. 1968, the Tet Offensive erupted across South Vietnam. The Americans could hear the change in their captors' demeanor, excitement, confidence, the belief that victory was near. Through carefully parsed propaganda sessions and overheard guard conversations, the prisoners pieced together what was happening. A massive North Vietnamese assault, fighting in the streets of Saigon. The war was reaching some kind of climax. For weeks, the prisoners debated through the tap code what this meant. Were the North Vietnamese winning? Would the war end soon? Would they be released or executed as loose ends? Then, slowly, the truth filtered through. The Tet Offensive had been a tactical disaster for the North. Massive casualties, Viet Cong infrastructure destroyed, but it was a strategic and psychological victory. American public opinion was turning against the war. Through the walls came tapped messages from new prisoners, recent shootdowns who brought news from the outside world, anti-war protests, political upheaval, President Johnson announcing he wouldn't seek re-election. The war was being lost at home even as it was being won in the field. For the prisoners, this news was devastating in ways the torture had never been. They'd endured years of suffering with the understanding that their sacrifice mattered, that they were part of a larger cause, that America would see the war through to victory or at least honorable peace. Now they learned that the country was giving up, that their suffering might be for nothing. Robert lay on his concrete slab that night and tried to process what it meant. He'd been a prisoner for 3 years. 3 years of torture, isolation, starvation. 3 years of rope burns and dislocated joints and waterboarding. 3 years of tapping through walls and resisting interrogations and maintaining a military bearing that his body could barely sustain anymore. For what? So politicians could negotiate away everything he'd suffered for? The tap code messages that night reflected the despair rippling through the prison. What's the point? Why are we still resisting? Maybe we should just cooperate and go home. Then came a message from Stockdale, passed cell to cell through the entire network. We are soldiers. We do our duty regardless of politics. We return with honor or not at all. That is the standard. Nothing has changed. 7 sentences. Simple. Direct. Brooking no argument. And somehow it was enough. The despair didn't disappear, but it was contained, channeled back into resistance. Because Stockdale was right. They were soldiers. The job didn't change just because it got harder or more complicated, or because the people back home stopped paying attention. The years ground on. 1968 became 1969. New prisoners arrived with each passing month. The prison system expanded. The Americans were redistributed to different camps, often without warning. You'd tap messages to a neighbor for months, build a relationship through concrete and code, then wake up one morning to silence. No response to your taps, just the hollow echo of an empty cell. Some prisoners were moved to camps closer to the Chinese border, places like Dog Patch, where the cold in winter was as brutal as the heat in summer. Others stayed in Hanoi, rotated through the various camps in a pattern the Americans never quite figured out. The Vietnamese seemed to move prisoners randomly sometimes just to disrupt the communication networks and command structures the Americans built. But the TAP code went with them. New prisoners learned it within days of arrival. Senior officers reestablished chains of command in each new location. The resistance continued, adaptive and persistent as a virus. Robert's body began to fail in ways that terrified him. His shoulders, damaged by years of rope torture, had limited range of motion. He could barely raise his arms above his head. His knees were damaged from kneeling on concrete for hours during punishment sessions. He'd lost at least 60 pounds from his already lean frame, his ribs visible through his skin, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed. His teeth were rotting from malnutrition and lack of dental care. He'd developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, probably tuberculosis or some other respiratory infection that was endemic in the prison population. His eyesight was deteriorating in the constant gloom of the cells, which had no real lighting beyond what filtered through cracks and gaps. He was 31 years old and felt like he was 70. The food remained barely adequate for survival. Rice, sometimes with bits of pumpkin or cabbage, twice a week, maybe a small piece of pork fat or a few ounces of tough beef. The prisoners called it zoo meat because they suspected it came from animals that had died at the Hanoi Zoo. The bread was moldy more often than not. The water had to be boiled mentally, even if you couldn't boil it physically. You just had to pretend it was clean and drink it anyway because dehydration would kill you faster than dysentery. Medical care was non-existent unless you were dying in a way that might embarrass the Vietnamese if you died before they could film a propaganda video. Broken bones were left to heal wrong. Infections were ignored until they became life-threatening. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical diseases swept through the prison population in waves. Through the TAP code came news of prisoners who didn't make it. Air Force Captain Earl Cobeil, tortured so severely and for so long that his mind broke completely. He died in his cell, probably from a combination of injuries and mental collapse. Navy Lieutenant Commander John McCamey, who developed a severe infection after torture that went untreated until it was too late. Each death was tapped through the network in a solemn ritual, the prisoner's name, rank, service number, date of death if known. Then a moment of silence where no one tapped, where the walls went quiet in tribute. Then someone would tap, GBU, God bless you, and the network would move on because there was nothing else to do. The living had to keep surviving, but survival required more than just physical endurance. It required mental disciplines that the prisoners developed through trial and error. Commander James Stockdale mentally wrote a book on Stoic philosophy, chapter by chapter, composing entire paragraphs in his head and then reviewing them until they were memorized. Air Force Major Bud Day designed and built an entire house in his mind, down to the placement of electrical outlets and the species of trees in the yard. Robert Shumaker taught himself calculus from memory, working through problems on an imaginary chalkboard in his head. These mental exercises weren't just distraction, they were survival mechanisms. The mind, like the body, needs exercise or it atrophies. In the sensory deprivation of solitary confinement, prisoners who didn't find ways to occupy their minds often deteriorated into depression, psychosis, or catatonia. The TAP code helped, but it wasn't enough by itself. You needed internal resources as well. You needed to be able to live inside your own head for hours or days at a time without going insane. Some prisoners couldn't manage it. The TAP code messages sometimes brought news of mental breakdowns, men who'd been strong for years but who suddenly snapped. started screaming and couldn't stop, had to be removed from the general prison population. The Americans never learned where those men went. To a hospital, maybe, or to somewhere worse. In 1969, Ho Chi Minh died. The prisoners learned about it from the propaganda sessions and from the obvious mourning of the guards. There was speculation through the tap code about what this might mean. Would the new leadership be more or less brutal? Would peace negotiations accelerate or stall? Nothing changed. The torture continued. The interrogations continued. The isolation continued. Robert marked his 4th anniversary as a prisoner, then his 5th. Time had become strange. The days dragged with unbearable slowness, but looking back, the years seemed to have passed in a blur. He could barely remember what freedom felt like, could barely remember Jane's face without concentration. His previous life as a naval aviator seemed like a story he'd heard about someone else. This was his life now. This cell, this concrete, this daily struggle to maintain sanity and dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Some part of him wondered if he'd ever leave, if he'd die here, just another name tapped through walls in memoriam. In 1970, a massive rescue attempt hit the prison camp at Son Tay, about 20 miles west of Hanoi. The prisoners there had been moved shortly before the raid, so the rescuers found empty cells. But the attempt itself was significant. It meant the American military hadn't forgotten them, hadn't written them off. When news of the raid filtered through to the main Hanoi prisons via new shootdowns and guard gossip, the Tap Code network came alive with discussion. The rescue attempt had failed, but it had succeeded in one crucial way. It reminded the prisoners that they mattered, that people were trying to bring them home. The Vietnamese response was predictable: increased security, more frequent cell searches, harsher punishments for suspected communication, but also a subtle shift in treatment. The raid had shown that Americans would come for their prisoners. That made the prisoners more valuable as hostages and more dangerous to mistreat in ways that might be documented. Slowly, incrementally, conditions began to improve. Not out of mercy. The Vietnamese didn't suddenly discover compassion, but out of calculation. Peace talks were happening in Paris. Eventually, there would be an accounting. Prisoners would go home and tell their stories. Better those stories not be too horrific. The food improved slightly. Medical care increased marginally. Some of the worst torturers were transferred to other duties. It wasn't humanitarian treatment by any stretch. It was just slightly less brutal than before. For men who'd lived through years of maximum brutality, even small improvements felt like miracles. A piece of bread that wasn't moldy. A bath once a month instead of once a season. A guard who didn't beat you automatically when entering your cell. These were the victories now. Not escape, not rescue, not even survival. Just the daily accumulation of small improvements that suggested maybe, possibly, eventually, there might be an end to this. Through the Tap Code came messages of cautious hope, orders from senior officers to maintain resistance but to recognize that the war was winding down. Speculation about prisoner exchanges, about peace agreements, about going home. Robert tried not to hope too much. Hope was dangerous. Hope could break you worse than torture when it was disappointed. Better to focus on today, on this hour, on getting through the next interrogation or the next bout of dysentery or the next night in the darkness. But still, despite his caution, hope grew. Tapped through walls, whispered in the darkness, kept alive by stubborn men who refused to quit. They'd survived this long. Maybe they could survive until the end. January 27th, 1973, Hỏa Lò Prison, Hanoi, North Vietnam. The Tap Code messages had been flowing for days, almost frantic with speculation. Something was happening. The guards were different, less hostile, almost nervous. Interrogations had stopped completely. The propaganda sessions had ended. Even the food had improved, relatively speaking. Real meat in the soup, bread that was almost fresh. Then, on the morning of January 27th, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life with an announcement in Vietnamese, then in heavily accented English. "The war is over. Peace agreement has been signed in Paris. You will be released and return to your families." Robert Shumaker sat on his concrete slab and didn't move. Couldn't move. He'd been a prisoner for 7 years, 6 months, and 9 days, 2,785 days. He'd stopped believing this moment would actually come. The tap code network exploded with messages. Is this real? Are they lying? What if it's a trick? Orders came down from Stockdale. Maintain bearing, trust nothing until we see American officials, stay disciplined. But it was real. Over the following days, American delegations arrived at the prisons, military officers in clean uniforms that seemed impossibly bright after years of seeing only prison rags. They walked through the cells, documenting conditions, taking statements, verifying identities. When an American colonel entered Robert's cell for the first time, Robert tried to stand at attention. His legs nearly gave out. He hadn't stood at proper attention in years. The colonel caught him, steadied him, and there were tears in the officer's eyes. "At ease, Commander, at ease. It's over. You're going home." The words didn't make sense. Going home. Home. The concept had become so abstract, so distant, that Robert couldn't quite grasp it as something that might actually happen. The release was staged according to the Paris Peace Accords. Prisoners would be released in groups based on Shootdown date, transported to Hanoi's Gia Airport, and flown to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. From there, back to the United States. Robert's group, among the earliest shootdowns, would be in the first release on February 12th. The days between the announcement and the actual release were surreal. The Vietnamese suddenly became almost cordial, as if the years of torture had been a misunderstanding between friends. They gave the prisoners new clothes, not prison uniforms, but civilian shirts and pants that didn't quite fit. They offered haircuts and shaves, provided soap and real food. Some prisoners refused the gestures. After years of brutality, they couldn't stomach the Vietnamese suddenly pretending to be generous. Others accepted pragmatically. They needed to be presentable for return home for the families who would be waiting. Robert accepted the haircut, but little else. He didn't want anything from these people. He just wanted to leave. February 12th, 1973. The prisoners were loaded onto buses and driven through Hanoi. Robert pressed his face against the window, seeing the city clearly for the first time. He'd flown over it countless times before being shot down, had seen it only as a target. Now he saw it as a place where people lived, children playing in streets, women carrying baskets, old men smoking on corners. It was strange to remember that the Vietnamese were people too, that they had lives and families and concerns beyond tormenting prisoners. The guards who'd beaten him for years had gone home to wives and children at the end of their shifts. Rabbit and Cat and Pig Eye were husbands, fathers, sons. Somewhere in this city they were returning to normal life while the Americans prepared to leave. Robert felt nothing for them, no forgiveness, no understanding, no connection, just a vast emptiness where emotion should have been. At Gia Airport, American aircraft waited, C-141 Starlifters with U.S. Air Force markings. The most beautiful sight Robert had seen in 7 years. The prisoners formed up in military order, oldest shoot-down first. Navy Captain Jeremiah Denton, shot down in 1965, led the formation. Behind him, Air Force Major Lawrence Guarino. Then Robert Shumaker, third in line. The Vietnamese had set up cameras, of course. This was a propaganda opportunity, showing the humane release of prisoners, documenting their good treatment. What the cameras captured instead was a line of skeletal men in ill-fitting clothes, standing as straight as their damaged bodies would allow, maintaining military bearing despite years of torture designed to break them. As each prisoner crossed the line into American custody, he saluted the receiving officer. Some of these salutes were crisp and sharp, others were fumbling, from hands that could barely rise to the forehead because of permanent nerve damage. But every man saluted. Robert climbed the stairs into the C-141, each step a challenge for legs weakened by years of malnutrition and leg irons. At the top of the stairs, he turned and looked back at Hanoi one last time. 7 years of his life. The worst years. Years that had broken him and rebuilt him into something different than the 27-year-old pilot who'd ejected over Thanh Hoa province. Inside the aircraft, American medical personnel waited with stretchers, IV bags, warm blankets. The interior smelled of disinfectant and coffee and something else. Freedom, maybe, though Robert knew that was just his imagination. The aircraft's engines spooled up. The C-141 rolled down the runway, lifted off, and banked away from Hanoi. Someone started cheering. Then others joined in. Soon the entire aircraft was filled with the sound of men who'd survived the impossible, who were finally actually truly going home. Robert didn't cheer. He couldn't. He sat in his seat, strapped in by medical personnel who were worried about his weight and vital signs and felt absolutely nothing. No joy, no relief, no emotion at all. Just emptiness. A Navy corpsman noticed his expression. "It's okay, sir. It'll take time. You're safe now." But Robert wasn't sure about that. His body was safe, yes, but his mind, that was going to take longer to bring home. Clark Air Base, Philippines. The prisoners were processed through a medical facility that had been specially prepared for their arrival. Examinations, x-rays, dental work, nutrition assessments. The doctors tried to hide their shock at the condition of the POWs, but Robert could see it in their faces, the weight loss, the untreated injuries, the permanent damage from years of torture. Some prisoners required immediate surgery, bones that had healed wrong and needed to be rebroken, infections that had become chronic, dental work that would take months. The medical staff worked around the clock trying to repair years of damage in days, but the physical damage wasn't the worst of it. The psychological impact was deeper, more complex, harder to treat. Robert lay in a clean hospital bed with white sheets and a real pillow and couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft. The room was too quiet. He kept listening for the tap code, for messages through the walls, for the sounds of guards approaching. Every time someone opened the door, he tensed, waiting for interrogation. A military psychologist came to speak with him. "It's normal," she said gently. "You've been in survival mode for 7 years. Your mind doesn't know how to shut that off yet. It will take time." Time. Everyone kept saying that. It will take time. Give it time. Time heals. But Robert had given 7 years to this war. He didn't want to give any more time. February 15th, 1973. The C-141 touched down at Travis Air Force Base in California. The prisoners were home, actually finally home. The reception was overwhelming. Crowds, banners, news cameras. The country had been watching Operation Homecoming, had seen the first prisoners step off planes in the Philippines. Now they wanted to welcome their heroes home. Heroes. That word kept appearing. The newspapers called them heroes. The politicians called them heroes. The crowds called them heroes. Robert didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a survivor, which was different. Heroes chose their fate. Survivors just refused to die. The reunions with families were staged at various bases across the country. Robert's reunion with Jane was scheduled for Naval Air Station Miramar. He hadn't seen her in 7 years. Hadn't touched her, kissed her, held her. Their entire marriage had been less than 2 years before he was shot down. When he finally saw her across the hangar, older now, her face lined with years of worry, he almost didn't recognize her. And he could see in her eyes that she almost didn't recognize him either. He'd left as a healthy 27-year-old officer weighing 175 pounds. He'd returned as a 34-year-old skeleton weighing 112 pounds, with gray in his hair and permanent damage in his shoulders and knees. They embraced, and it felt like hugging a stranger. They'd both changed too much. The man who left and the woman who waited were different people than the ones who were reuniting now. "I thought about you every day," Jane whispered against his chest. Robert wanted to say the same, but it wouldn't be true. There had been days, weeks, months, where he'd barely thought about her at all because thinking about her hurt too much, reminded him too sharply of everything he'd lost. He'd survived by learning not to want things too badly, not to hope too much, not to let himself feel emotions that could be used as leverage against him. Now he had to learn to feel again. Had to learn to be a husband, not a prisoner. Had to learn to live in a world where people didn't hurt you systematically, where food was abundant, where you could walk outside without guards. It should have been easy. It wasn't. The years after homecoming were harder than Robert expected. The country was tired of the war, tired of hearing about it, ready to move on. The POWs were celebrated briefly, then largely forgotten as America turned its attention to other crises: Watergate, economic troubles, the ongoing Cold War. Many of the prisoners struggled to reintegrate. Divorce rates among returning POWs were astronomically high. Careers were damaged or destroyed. Men who'd been promoted on schedule while imprisoned discovered they'd been passed by for important commands because they'd missed crucial years of professional development. Physical injuries limited what they could do even if they wanted to continue serving. And always, there were the nightmares, the flashbacks, the psychological scars that didn't show up on x-rays but that were more debilitating than broken bones. Some POWs handled it better than others. James Stockdale went on to become a vice admiral, won the Medal of Honor, ran for vice president. Jeremiah Denton became a U.S. senator. Others found ways to build new lives, new careers, new purposes. But some never really came home. Their bodies returned, but parts of their minds stayed in those cells, listening for tap codes through the walls, waiting for the next interrogation, expecting betrayal and pain because that's what the world had taught them for years. Robert Shumaker fell somewhere in the middle. He continued his naval career, eventually retiring as a captain. He had a family, a life, achievements, but the Hanoi Hilton never completely left him. In quiet moments, he'd find his fingers tapping patterns on tables, old messages from old conversations through concrete walls. He'd wake at 3 a.m., disoriented, confused about where he was. The tap code had saved his sanity during imprisonment, but it had also become so deeply embedded in his neural pathways that he couldn't completely turn it off. Years later, he would attend POW reunions. Men who'd shared cells or tapped through walls would gather, older now, grayer, their bodies bearing the permanent marks of their time in captivity. They were the only ones who truly understood, the only ones who knew what it meant to survive year after year of systematic cruelty, to maintain resistance when there was no logical reason to do so, to build community through concrete walls using nothing but stubborn determination. At these reunions, sometimes late at night after the formal events ended, someone would tap out a message on a table or a wall, and the old reflexes would activate, heads would turn, men would listen, fingers would tap responses. The code they'd used to survive had become part of their identity, part of who they were and would always be. The Hanoi Hilton eventually became a museum. Tourists visit it now, walk through the cells, see the displays. The Vietnamese government claims the facility provided humane treatment. The displays show images of prisoners playing sports, reading books, looking healthy and content. The surviving POWs know differently. They live the truth that the museum obscures. They know what really happened in those cells, behind those walls, in the darkness where no cameras recorded and no witnesses watched except the men who suffered and the men who inflicted suffering. Robert Shumaker returned to Vietnam in 1994, more than 2 decades after his release. He visited Hỏa Lò Prison, the Hanoi Hilton, and walked through the cells as a tourist. He stood in the interrogation room where he'd been waterboarded. He looked at the wall he'd spent years tapping messages through. It was smaller than he remembered, shabbier, almost pathetic in its ordinariness. It was hard to believe that this place had contained so much suffering, had been the stage for such extraordinary endurance. But it had. And the men who survived it carried the proof in their bodies and minds for the rest of their lives. They'd entered the Hanoi Hilton as individuals, pilots, warriors, men with their own identities and stories. They'd emerged as brothers, united by shared suffering and shared resistance. The tap code had made them more than prisoners. It had made them a community that refused to be broken. And that ultimately was their victory, not escape, not defeat of their captors, not even survival, but the simple, stubborn refusal to be alone. To tap through walls even when it seemed pointless. To maintain hope even when there was no logical reason for hope. To be human even when everything conspired to reduce them to something less. That was what the Vietnamese never understood and could never break. That was what came home with them, tapped into their bones and souls. That was the legacy of the Hanoi Hilton.